Yeah, let me introduce you first, and I'll introduce myself, and then we can go on to that topic. So, I am with Dr. Laura Honos Webb, clinical psychologist, who has focused on ADHD for the past 17 years and also has two children. One of them, well, both of them actually were interning for us this
Mm-hmm.
summer. And my name is Penn King, and I focus on mental health as a venture investor, but I also help run Bonding Health with Laura, and we are focused on digital solutions for parents of children with ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, I open up the stage and we can talk about the self regulation and some of the other findings over the last 17 years or so that you've been focused on childhood ADHD.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's also important to put some of this in the context of, just in July, a study came out that found that the ADHD medications didn't actually improve ADHD children's grades. And this was a well done study. And I think a lot of parents and experts were really, surprised, if maybe even shocked by that, because it made them think, well, what else can we do? What are some other things as parents that we can do? And I think, we all have that sense. As I said, it's kind of common sense that as a parent can manage their mood, that will be helpful for their child to manage their mood. And in fact, the research does suggest that um, that parent regulation helps child regulation. And this is also true, that parents who adopted a more mindful parenting style, for example, and this means taking a broader perspective, that those parents, it lowered their stress and they were able to interact with more warmth with their child, and their child was able to gain more self control. And so that's one area of regulating that mood. But another outcome that we often don't think about is having positive expectations for kids. And they actually looked at studies where parents had more positive expectations, and they found that they reported less frequent negative experiences with their child and less intense negative emotions during those experiences. And so they were also more likely to predict a positive future. And it's so important to differentiate positive expectations from really rigid standards. A simple example is if your child is talking a lot and moving around a lot in class, they can get in trouble. Sometimes even people still in this day and age will get sent to the principal's office for those kinds of things. But when we take a broader perspective, parents can create positive expectations by thinking about, he may be interested, he wants to be a physical therapist. Well, physical therapists talk all day and move around all day, or people in sales. There's many professions that as adults, people can be very, very successful today. I was just reading that, can be very, very successful, even although the school itself can be a challenge. And they can also do well in school as
Mm-hmm.
well. But maintaining positive expectations makes a big difference for the child and the parent.
Yeah. Hello, but hello, by the way,
Hi.
to the user. I know it's an unknown user. We're using the StreamYard right now, so um, we can't actually respond. I think I need to log into StreamYard for that. But yeah, you bring up a great point. I think when it comes to positive expectations, the exciting thing about bonding health and the exercises is the fact that you focus in on 12 different symptoms. And these
Mm-hmm.
symptoms, right, are very closely related to how you diagnose ADHD. And
Mm-hmm.
these exercises help to change the perspective. And it's only it's a very short amount of questions where you start off with really the symptom itself. And by the end of our exercises, you really have more of a positive perspective. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to share more and to share the prototype with our group. Um, and I guess over the years, was it kind of one or were obviously, I would assume, more than one kind of aha moment where you realized, okay, well, this is really the core focus. This should be the core focus, because I feel
Mhm.
like this has so much to do with kind of mental health in general, right? Is, seeing the positive, in a negative situation. It's a way to overcome challenges,
Mhm.
and that goes a lot further than just ADHD. But I guess, was it, obviously it was I would assume it was a lot of experiences with clients, but was there one kind of one particular experience? Because I feel like the work,
Mhm.
you told me about the work, and that's obviously been, adopted by Oprah and so many other
Mhm.
people. And it's these very simple questions. So was that kind of inspiration for this, for developing these exercises that we're, showcasing and going to start rolling out?
Well, I mean, to go to the broader question of when did I think that finding the strengths and the positives was going to be the most positive, was the most helpful, was when I was actually teaching. When I was a graduate student, I was teaching an undergraduate class in abnormal psychology. And I had a student that had ADHD, and he was not able to do well at all on the multiple choice test. And so here he is, he's even made it to college. But he was one of the people that was the most engaged and interested, and he wanted to do research. And I realized that the things that we measure, how we often give grades, in terms of multiple choice tests and memorization, didn't at all capture a person's capacity. He was a very innovative thinker. Um, and there was a lot of so it was so obvious that he had so many talents, and yet he was crippled with, self-esteem was crippled because he was doing very poorly in college. And so that was it was one of the places where I saw that we're really, it's a very narrow band thing, and people can go on to be successful in many other different areas and have many different talents. And so that was a kind of one of the early things that made me realize that we have to look much more broadly. What, not only what this person can't do, but what can they do? What are they very good at? And so that was the starting point. But it's, and I kind of come back to this idea that it's common sense. So, for example, in in the literature of John Gottman and his wife, they found that, but through doing extensive studies, that every relationship needs to have this balance of 5 positive interactions to every negative interaction.
Mm.
And while the research has not been done with the kids, it's been done in other areas, in work settings, for example. But it's, again, a common sense notion that there has to be more positives than negatives for a person to be able to sustain that sense of self-confidence and self-efficacy. And think about it, our core motivation comes from this idea that I can do this, I'm capable of doing this, I'm competent, I'm capable. And
Mm-hmm.
so, to think about how we define ourselves is going to affect our mood, our emotions, our attention, our motivation. And,
So we have one question here in the chat, and I will read it to you, Laura.
okay.
I have a question about lying and ADHD. Our son will lie about things that he won't necessarily get in trouble with, but will damage his relationships. We don't want to shame him, but don't know how to address it. He is 19 and not dependent on us, so don't know how to deal with it in regards to college.
Mm-hmm. And so this can, have to do with what are the, kind of consequences of, what are the reasons or motivations for the lying.
Mm.
And so that would be, I'd want to know a lot more about that. Sometimes without knowing any context, it's hard, but it could come back to this idea of lying to, because they lack self-confidence, they might be trying to cover up some failures. And so this is why it may be even the same idea that as we build up a person's confidence in themselves, they may be able to say directly what it is that he's trying to cover up, or they may be able to accept themselves. And it's hard to accept that a person is if any person that a deficit disorder. I think we misestimate how easily that label can be internalized and generalized. And so a person may feel insecure and lacking confidence, telling some lies to either cover that up. And so I do think that some of the correctives here about finding some of those strengths may be a corrective. And I think this idea of self-compassion and self-acceptance. So again, we don't really have any context here in terms of what the lies might be about, but accepting that, that whatever it is that they're trying to hide, having self-compassion for their challenges and their struggles. And so that these can be elements to emphasize not only finding your strengths, but acceptance of the things that are not strengths and self-compassion for those weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of shame. And if you can kind of accept that you're not perfect and accept that, there isn't this mold that you have to follow in some of these challenging experiences or experiences that you may have shame around. If you view those as very educational experiences that have made you into who you are, I mean, that's kind of sort of how I look at, certain challenges that I've had in the past. So as someone who's struggled with ADHD.
Do you want to say some more about your challenges with ADHD and some of the things that have helped you that might be helpful to our listeners?
For sure. I would say that exercise has been a big tool for me. I also do something called Miracle Morning, which focuses on savers, which is silence, so meditation. Mm-hmm. And then I'm blanking on the visualization and exercise. Obviously, I just said that. Affirmations. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of, I'll look it up, but I've recently been doing that. I mean, I've been meditating for quite some time, and it's definitely been something that has helped me in a big way. And I think it's a really, really good way to just find stillness, especially if you're hyperactive. And that has definitely been a game changer for me. I would say also, the visualization and the affirmations is really important because we have so much negative self-talk. So in the morning to write out what you're proud of, write out what you're thankful for is a really, really good way to start the morning as well. And then, visualizing what you want is something that I think is also something that I started doing, which definitely helped me in terms of providing context around what I want. And then just clarity, like back, you say, that is true, right? If you're having a hard time, you can look back at those affirmations and say, I should be thankful for that, right? I have good, good family, or I have, this, or I have my health, I have my 2 legs. So those are definitely tools that have helped me. I would say that one other thing is definitely I listen to a lot of, I would say I've listened to a lot of like motivational videos. I'm a big fan of like Wayne Dyer. I really like his methodology. You change the way you look at things, and the things you look at change. So about, changing the perspective, which has so much to do with the exercises. So I'd say that the exercises have been pretty great. I do use them at times. I also do use the quicks, and I listen to those reels just to put me back into kind of better balance.
Yeah. And I mean, for our, people that are listening today, some quick tips in terms of mindfulness. You use the word mindfulness. Now, this doesn't have to, I really do recommend the practice of mindfulness. People with ADHD benefit from mindfulness, but it's also harder for them to do. So there's some other quick tips that you can use to, get some of these benefits of emotional regulation. And so the first one is imagine, for example, if you're very fearful about your child or very worried about your child, sometimes staying in that negative mood makes it hard to build that strong relationship. And I think bonding health, bonding is about the parent-child relationship. And the idea is to sustain that positive relationship, that it can be really helpful not to what we would call negatively looping or obsessing about your worries and concerns. And so one tool is if you imagine sort of a train, and a train is coming into the train station all the time. And imagine that train says worry thought. Now you can notice that train has pulled into the station, but you don't have to go for a ride on it. And so that's an example of what mindful parenting could be, is that I'm really worried about this. And so then the first step is to say, okay, I'm worried, but rather than to go, and then if this happens, then this will happen. And that's kind of the train of thought that I'm referencing. And then if this happens, then that's going to happen. And then, of course, by that time, you're very worried and upset, and it's hard to build that relationship from that place. And so once you take that observation perspective, that mindful perspective, you can then practice diaphragmatic breathing. And diaphragmatic breathing just means breathing in through your nose and into your belly. And through that process, that is one of the number one recommended stress management tools. And so through diaphragmatic breathing, you can begin to calm yourself down. And again, it's a common sense notion, but research supports that a regulated parent can help to regulate their child. And so that can be the next step. And then, as you noticed, is in your own personal story, it also becomes about finding the positives. Well, what is your child doing right? What classes are they good at? What activities are they good at? What are some very positive?
Sorry, we have one more. We have one more. I don't. It's not so much a question; it's more a comment. But my anxiety definitely gets in the way. Don't want to nag about stuff getting done, but I end up nagging. I don't know how to achieve goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we're addressing that first part right here, right now, which is noticing, okay, the anxiety isn't helpful. It's going to make it harder for me to feel connected to my child. And so one of the first thing one sort of behavioral tool would, of course, be to say, I notice that you're not getting started with your work, and then leave. And that gives them a chance to take that information in and to maybe do something differently. And so when I say leave, and when you leave, you take that time to emotionally balance yourself. And that could be the diaphragmatic breathing. It could be, okay, I'm noticing I'm having some anxious thoughts. And it could be thinking about positives, meaning times he's had success with getting stuff done. And so from that point, instead of nagging, when you come back, you can see what's happening. But you also might want to adopt a perspective of empathy. And so that could look like, depending on what's going on, I see it's hard to get started. What do what's making it so hard? And they might say, that I'm afraid that I'm, not going to get the problems right. And then you could say, okay, so what could you do? You could say, when was the time that you were successful? Or you could say, what are some tools that you could use to be more successful? Or, and then you may, do some simple problem solving. But again, to always start with that empathy, like where are they coming from? And it may be that you end up having a really deep conversation. It could be you say, what's making it hard for you to get started? And they say, well, someone at school today said something that really hurt my feelings, and I'm really distracted by that. And then now you have a chance to bond with your child, to connect with your child, to have a conversation with your child. And it may be there's some problem solving that needs to be done around whatever happened. It could be helping your child take a broader perspective. It could be you need to talk to the teacher. It could be any number of different things that come out of that. but then you now know a lot more about what is happening with your child. And it also shows how the child's emotions can be one of negative emotions can also be part of what makes it hard for them to get started.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, that it's a very exciting finding that I think has been really tough for parents to adopt, obviously, because it's tough to get access to something that's going to quickly change your perspective. And I think it's really exciting seeing a lot of these digital health platforms more specifically focus on depression and anxiety in adults, but to see bonding health and to see other products start to tap into um, positive psychology um,
Mm-hmm.
for parenting an an ADHD child who has a lot of gifts, and to kind of teach the reappraisal um, early on. I think, like you said, it creates this comfort zone. It creates this safe space for child to not feel under fire. Because I know when I was growing up, I always felt under fire. And
Mm-hmm.
the people that were most calm, the people that were most empathetic, I was able to open up to.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, and even the teachers, I remember there's certain memories to this day that I still remember of certain teachers who just had that empathy. They understood I was hyper. They understood that, and they had empathy for that
Mm-hmm.
versus, erupting or getting angry, which is, it's the best of, for me, that was the best way to teach them. And same.
Yeah, and I think one of the what your story tells us is a couple things is that so the anxiety and the conflict or frustration often will be in the child as well. I mean, the child isn't like I want to just procrastinate all day just to make other people mad. They're usually struggling with those emotions themselves. And so when we prioritize these tools of noticing the negative feelings but not going for a ride with them, or taking those calming breaths to manage our own stress, finding some positives. It's from those places that you can actually begin to solve the problems. And so sometimes those problems have to do with really, logistics of organization. Like, do we need to have, some organizing tools? Do we need to have more communication between the parent and the teacher? Do we need to have some kind of activity before homework that is good for your brain, like exercise, or maybe breathing tools, or maybe some fun time, because we know that happiness increases attention. And so the idea is that when we can reduce that conflict, when we can create a strong parent child bond, there's going to be more communication, more of a sense of feeling understood with more empathy. And that's really a good place to actually solve those problems.
I completely agree. And I think, this has there's also this there it's quite important to discuss empathy around medication as well, because if a child is on medication, they're going to be much more irritable and anxious at certain times of the day. And I remember that it was very tough connecting with others. I felt jittery all the time. I didn't have an appetite. It was very challenging. And I think it's really important as a parent to have empathy for that if your children are taking stimulant medication. And I think it's something that a lot of parents don't focus on. And that's very challenging because you
Mm-hmm.
definitely feel, you feel like there's something really wrong with you. And
Mm-hmm.
to be honest, a lot of times there isn't. There are a lot of gifts under that. So it
Mm-hmm.
kind of goes back to that, that, taking the broader perspective, but also having empathy for the fact that, there are some pharmaceutical drugs involved.
Mm-hmm. And so from your personal experience, and I think you said something that I hear a lot, and I don't think people realize. You said, because we think of ADHD as a label that applies to school, but what you said was, I felt like something was really wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And say some more.
I don't know if this is still how it goes, because I'm 34 years old now. But when I was a child, I would go in the nurse's office, right? They would give you a pill. They would make sure you swallowed it. It was a whole thing. It definitely felt, it felt odd. And I felt odd more than it felt odd. And, there's definitely at that time, empathy wasn't as present in a lot of the classrooms. And, you have to be forced to the front of the classroom, right? Or there were certain things that they required you to do. And I was in the wrong school growing up. I was a very, very competitive, super competitive, private day school. And it was just probably the wrong program for me. But I didn't really see a change in grades until about ninth grade. So grades were actually decent for a period of time. But I would say that you definitely feel different when there are these little things. And I think that this kind of empathy and kind of doing those things in a different way, and really focusing on the way that you express what's happening and have I think, really honest conversation with your child is really, really important, because I was confused for years. I was confused around how I was feeling. And I was also confused around, I guess I was changing medication different times. There was, it was kind of like I was an experiment. And that's kind of how I felt. And that was not, kind of always been a creative person. And I definitely felt my creative juices and my personality kind of almost died. So it was hard to kind of find myself and find who I actually was and what my real emotions were after I stopped taking medication. At around 17, I stopped medication. Haven't since. And that was challenging. So yeah, for a period of time, it's tough to identify. You have two different personalities, right? You have a personality on medication, which is hard to kind of identify, like what that is. It's different at certain times. And then you have someone after, like when it wears off. And you're kind of you're having an identity crisis, sort of, right? Because you're kind of like, okay, and then some Saturdays, I was taking it. Some Saturdays I wasn't. Obviously, having a certain tolerance was tough, right? Sometimes it would stop working and test something else. And then I had some weirder experiences, like I had one psychiatrist who got arrested he was consuming medications himself, and he had an opioid problem. So that was wild. So there was it was pretty crazy.
And one of the things that as we're kind of going through this is that you are working as an entrepreneur and a founder of a startup, and there has been a lot of literature about the overlap between ADHD and entrepreneurship, and it kind of points to this idea that in school you're expected to be really good or good at a lot of things, if not everything. There's so many subjects, but as an adult, to be successful, you need to be really good at something. You don't have to go take a history test about who was the king of France in 1885 or whatever it is, meaning that you focus on something that you love, that's something that you see is making an impact on the world, And I think, that the focus on grades actually may be um, reducing this, that the focus on grades, I believe, would reduce our interest in something, because it becomes, I just kind of go back to the history example. Let's say you're taking a history class and you could be really, really interested in it, and you're reading about all this stuff and you're curious. It was so different back then. How could it be like that? And it might make you think about a lot about today's world and those days. And it could be very interesting. But when you're like, wait a minute, I actually just have to memorize this because I have to get a good grade. So any natural level of interest a person might have, and who knows, a person might want to move to France or learn French, from reading history, or, be interested in the personalities of history and go on to, be a leader in some way. But the focus, when we talk about putting all the focus on grades, which of course is the culture of today, and that there's, what's missing is this intrinsic interest. And you can imagine kids finding something kind of interesting and being like, oh wait, I need to memorize all of this material. I can't just dive into this thing that's very fascinating for me. And I think that interest, well, I don't think this, if you open up the dictionary, attention and interest are synonyms. They're the same thing. That interest means attentiveness. And so maybe, this pressure that we put on kids for grades may be in some ways reducing their attention. And it may be that as we put more and more emphasis on grades, it's made it harder and harder for people to pay attention, in the sense that the idea that grades are what matters, then learning becomes less interesting and intrinsic. Well, it's good to learn about the past so that we learn how to do things in the future. For a lot of people may not find history to be the most relevant course in the world, but of course there's benefits, and it could just be interesting in itself. It's like literature. And so the idea here is that, as you're talking about that it was almost like it's harder to find that opportunity to what's interesting to you, when the thing that matters is the grades.
Yeah, to connect back to the exercises is, if you focus on reframing these symptoms and getting to the positive traits, you accelerate the chances of your child feeling comfortable to share their gifts and to focus in on their gifts and to focus in on their interest, which we know that ADHD individuals hyper focus.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's something that they love, they go all in. My story, obviously, and seeing the pharma system and seeing, a lot of the undersupply, and, therapy being cost prohibitive, and not covered by insurance and all this other things. But then my story, has, created that tenacity, right? And that kind of relentlessness, around really just focusing in on this nonstop, going all in, working weekends, right? Thinking about it when I'm sleeping, constant. And I think what's exciting is, the exercises, can help parents put their child in a situation where they can focus in on that. And I think for a long time, because there was some anger, there was some frustration, there was some of that, I definitely felt an urge to go away from what was authentic to me and what was true to what I wanted to do. Which, to be honest, I was very artistic. I loved painting. I loved carpentry. I liked shop class, like a lot of the creative things. And I would say for definitely a period of years, that was fairly restricted. And I think a lot of that had to do with being scolded,
Mm-hmm.
versus saying, hey, it seems like that's what you really like.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like, okay, you don't really like that. You kind of like that. You should go in, go all in on that. And I think this inner child, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
this idea of an inner child is really going back into yourself and finding, like, trying to identify who your true self is. and what you wanted to do when there weren't barriers, right? Like breaking down walls and doing this stuff. And a lot of people, right, like as you get older, a lot of fear can build, and it's about kind of breaking that fear. And I think changing the perspective, right, is the way to do that. So it kind of comes totally full circle. And I would say that, I've embraced those challenges. I'm proud of, the work we're doing, because it's so important. And yeah, I'm glad I was able to share some that definitely opened me up. It's been a long time. I think I've probably shared some of those stories with one or two people. So it's cool to, it's probably healthy that I spoke about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And, as we, think about wrapping up, if anyone has any more questions, feel free to put that in the chat. I really think that at the core, as you're saying, that those things that you're naturally interested in are going to be fuel for attention. And then on the other side, the things that are going to disrupt our attention are those negative interactions, are those feelings of self-doubt, we all have that experience. Even as adults, we have the experiences of that. Those emotions make it hard for us to focus and to get our work done. And that not feeling connected makes it harder, to, again, stay focused, because you then begin to be filled with self-doubt. And so I think the target here is about helping the parent to reduce their stress, to manage their mood, and to have positive expectations for themselves and their child. And then for the child also to have this model and to have this opportunity for empathy. So for example, when kids are always interrupting, that's a symptom of ADHD. And so, but if we have some empathy, maybe they're interrupting because they want to connect with the parents. They want to say, oh, but hey, wait, you got to hear what happened at school today, or I got to tell you this thing. And they're interrupting their parent because they're wanting that connection. And so what we see as interruption could be a desire to connect. And so when we look at those, what's underneath these behaviors, that can be, the empathy can actually lead to finding those gifts that, my child wants to connect with me. My child likes to connect with people. My child, all of those would be good things. And so, and it can be that, of course, you say, I love to hear these stories. You may want to, but you may want to practice waiting your turn or whatever that looks like. But the empathy is about seeing what's underneath the behavior, that may be a need that they want to get met, or some kind of a strength, which is that deep connection. And they're interrupting their parent because they're wanting that maybe.
Absolutely. I was opening up the Facebook to try to do it through that, but it didn't work. So I think in closing, this was fantastic. It was great sharing my story. It was great hearing expert advice from you. It was great getting some interactions from parents. And I'm very excited for us to share the prototype link to help with a lot of the struggles around symptoms that can be reframed. So it's a very exciting time, especially for Bonding Health. So thank you so much, Laura, for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, Penn. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.